Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. Since the beginning of her history, the state of Maine held legal executions for crimes, with a total of 21 lawful executions having been carried out in the Pine Tree State. And the first lawful execution took place in what is now York, Maine, and the first person lawfully executed was a woman. Stay with us and hear the true story of the hanging of good wife Katherine Cornish on this all-new weekly episode of Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is the Stories from Maine weekly podcast for the second week of May, 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
Before our podcast story begins, there is one note to mention. Since this story took place in 1644, there is little in the way of images to go along with this story. Therefore, our Stories from Maine logo will be static for the episode. Now, let's head over to Oscar for our all-new feature story. The Execution of Good Wife Katherine Cornish.
In 1644, just 22 years after Sir Ferdinando Gorges received his first patent, establishing his dominion over what would eventually become Maine, and while England itself was 2 years into their bloody civil war, a Puritan settlement at Agamenticus, in what is now known as York, saw a heinous murder committed amongst them. The great Puritan migration from England was nearly over. Tens of thousands of Puritans, Anglican religious separatists, had now settled in New England. Many that arrived were a part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and a band of these pioneers had settled to the northern portion of the colony. In the province of Maine, at the settlement of Agamenticus, Massachusetts, in what is now the city of York, Maine, by December of that year, a horrible murder had been discovered. The lifeless body of a man was found partially submerged in the Saco River. He had been brutally beaten, bruised, and murdered. His body was impaled with a stake or wooden pole through his side, and his remains were still within his canoe. The canoe itself was weighted down with clay and rocks, and it was sunken in a deep portion of the river. The victim was later identified as Richard Cornish, a well-known local man who had earned a reputation for being a hard-working Puritan, one who had arrived in New England in about 1629. Richard Cornish had left England and first settled in Weymouth in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There, he met and married in about 1634 to a woman named Katherine. By 1640, Katherine had earned a tarnished reputation in Weymouth for being a loose and wicked woman, one who was known to lay with other men. Katherine's sullied and growing reputation had become well known in Weymouth, and a good deal of talk had made living in Weymouth difficult for the couple. As scandal began to rise and dominate their daily life throughout the town, to escape the spreading scandal, Richard and Katherine moved northward to a Puritan colony at Agamenticus, later called Georgiana, where the couple set up a new life with a fresh start. Yet, by 1644, Katherine's sullied reputation had caught up with her and reignited as she began, once again, having extramarital affairs with some of the men of the young and growing city of Agamenticus. It is believed that sometime in December of 1644, Richard had come home unexpectedly one day and discovered his wife with another man. Quickly, A confrontation ensued between Richard and his wife, and the man she was bedding. Soon after, the untimely death of Richard Cornish is believed to have been the result. The local authorities of Agamenticus began an investigation into the murder of Richard Cornish and the immediately suspected culprits. Right off, Native Americans were quickly exonerated of having had anything to do with the murder, as it was not believed that any Indian would waste a perfectly good canoe. Next, strangers to the city were fully crossed off the list of murder suspects, as no strangers or visitors to Agamenticus had been seen or noticed within the village. It quickly became crystal clear to investigators that the killer of Richard Cornish had to be one of their own residents. We'll be right back.
All new episodes of our Stories from Maine podcasts stream each Saturday on our YouTube and Spotify channels. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. Please help us to keep our podcasts free to all by following or subscribing to us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
Thanks, Rachel. Now, let's get back to Oscar and the incredible conclusion of our story, the execution of good wife, Katherine Cornish.
Once investigators had eliminated Native Americans, strangers to the town, and visitors to Agamenticus, investigators then began looking at residents of the small Puritan community. Katherine Cornish, the murder victim's wife, quickly became the new #1 suspect in Richard's murder. But there was a problem. Katherine could not have delivered the severity of the beating that Richard had suffered, nor could she have had the strength to impale his body in the way in which that fatal blow was struck. And another problem also faced investigators. Being a small female, Katherine could not have carried her husband's body over the distance to the river, nor could she have withstood the cold December waters of the rushing Saco River long enough to discard and sink Richard's remains. There were but a few men in town who were suspected of being lovers with Goodwife Cornish, and were also strong enough to have committed the murder, carried the body to the river, and also have struck the fatal blow and have sunk in the canoe. Now, investigators turned to these potential suspects in the murder of Richard Cornish. The first of the suspected murderers was a servant man named Edward. The second suspect was the son of the local minister, and the third of the suspected philanderers was the man who was also in charge of the investigation itself, the mayor of Agamenticus, Roger Guard. The investigation seemed to be going nowhere fast, as cold hard facts and evidence were seemingly hard to come by. But investigators had one card left to play, and both Edward and Katherine were each taken to the Agamenticus Cold House, a place where ice for the community was stored, and where Richard's battered body was also being preserved. The two accused lovers were taken to view Richard's remains, and they were each asked to touch the body, one at a time. This request was known as a trial by touch, and it was believed to be a sure way the dead could speak to the living after having been murdered. When Edward touched Richard's cold body, nothing happened, but when Goodwife Cornish touched her husband's corpse, Richard's wounds quickly seeped blood. Investigators reasoned that Richard was speaking from the hereafter and was posthumously identifying his killer. For investigators, their case was solved, and Katherine Cornish was their #1 suspect. And she would be tried for murder, regardless of other contrary facts in the case. Although Edward did admit to sleeping with Katherine Cornish, he was no longer considered a murder suspect. And since he denied being guilty of adultery, Mayor Roger Guard was also no longer considered a suspect. And the third man, the minister's son, was also cleared of suspicion, as it was doubtful that a son of a minister could be guilty of such a crime as murder. Yet, the question of who did brutally assault and murder Richard Cornish and carry his body to the river, submerge his remains in his canoe under the frigid and raging waters of the Saco River, was no longer a question of consequence. Nor was it a matter investigators were concerned with. As far as investigators were concerned, the murder victim had told the living who his murderer was. Despite her pleas of innocence in her husband's death, Katherine Cornish was tried and found guilty of adultery and murder. It was a shocking trial, one that caused a great deal of talk, which spread across Maine and Massachusetts like wildfire. Katherine was immediately sentenced to death by hanging. She was soon executed and laid to rest, presumably in an unmarked grave somewhere in York. A total of 21 individuals were lawfully executed by hanging between 1644 and 1885, when execution was finally outlawed in Maine. And goodwife Katherine Cornish would not be the first woman executed in Maine history. In fact, there would be 2 women who would stand on the gallows and meet their death at the end of the hangman's noose in Maine. In all, 16 whites, 2 Native Americans, and 3 African Americans would plunge to their deaths for crimes ranging from murder to rape and robbery. In early 2025, just over 380 years after the hanging of Katherine Cornish, a movement began to see Katherine exonerated of the crime of murder, as the evidence in Katherine's case borders more on the absurd than the factual. A proposal was put forward asking current Governor Janet Mills, Maine's first female executive, to consider granting a posthumous pardon to Maine's first female ever executed in Maine. The Pine Tree State would eventually add this story as an original first to the state's many firsts in her illustrious and sometimes nefarious history. And today, the story of the execution of goodwife Katherine Cornish stands as one of the oldest and more unjust of our stories from Maine.
We hope you have enjoyed this week's feature story of the execution of goodwife Katherine Cornish. All new weekly episodes of our Stories from Maine podcast streams each Saturday on our YouTube and Spotify channels. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Stories from Maine. And we hope you will visit our Stories from Maine page on Facebook, where over 40,000 subscribers learn why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. Thanks for listening.
Our weekly Stories from Maine article, published in the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times Record, can be found on newsstands each Friday and can be viewed online. The Stories from Maine logos are a registered trademark of Lori Suzanne Dell, and all original content is copyright 2025, with all rights reserved. Please come back next Saturday for another all-new episode of Stories from Maine. Thanks for listening.